Okay, amazing. Thanks so much. Sorry to keep you waiting. I think there was some logistic things we were working on, but really appreciate you making the time to be here. So my name is Nancy Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Consulting at the Diversity Institute. I know it says Research Special Projects. It's just a fancy way of saying consulting, I think. And you're here today to engage on a conversation on embedding equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, or inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, IDEA, within climate resilient infrastructure. So we've been doing some work in this regard for a couple of years now with a number of partners like Standards Council of Canada, the Digital Governance Council, and other experts in the space to really try to understand what it would look like if we embedded IDEA into the process of designing and retrofitting infrastructure. Now, I will say up front that my background is not in climate. My background is in IDEA, and then what I do is try to understand how IDEA links to different sectors. So I do work in policing, with municipalities. I was actually just in a session with healthcare professionals. But what I do is try to work with experts in the space, so climate experts, and then feed IDEA into their processes to then ensure that the end result better meets the needs of communities. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I think we have like an hour, and I will leave some space at the end for some questions and dialogue. I would love to hear from all of you because I imagine there's some climate experts in the space. Okay, so this is what we'll be going through today. I'll share a little bit about us so you know who we are and what we do. We'll talk about the disproportionate impacts of climate change on diverse communities. I won't go too in depth because I imagine that many of you are well versed in it, but I think there's a couple of things that people, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to know if you're going to share the slides afterwards.
I think they will share the slides, yeah. But if not, why don't you get my contact after?
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. And you know, yes?
I wanted to attend the New Right session.
Oh, I don't know where that is. Which one is it, sorry?
Somebody told me it's in Canada, so I came. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm not your girl.
It's next door.
It's next door?
It's this way.
Okay, no hard feelings. Is there anyone else here who, as you heard me talking, you're like, this is not it? I'm like, or not be. Okay, no hard feelings if it's not. Okay. Otherwise, you'd be getting up halfway through and I'd be like, oh, it's really going badly. Okay, great. Now's your chance. Okay, so we're going to be talking about some of the disproportionate impacts on different communities. So women, Indigenous people, racialized people. I'll go through it because I think there's some things that people often don't consider. And of course, climate change impacts us all, but it impacts different communities in different ways. So we'll talk about it. We'll talk about some of the benefits of embedding IDEA into climate resilient infrastructure. Now, I'll be honest with you that from my research, this is fairly new, and of course, it takes a long time to measure benefits. Like if I wanted to do something about like, this will save the Canadian government $3 trillion, I mean, I'd have to like be studying this for a long time. So what I tried to do is look at the research and find some tangible benefits, but I won't be able to offer you some of those like longitudinal study type benefits. Then we'll go into some of the challenges in doing this work. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there are some challenges in doing this. And I will say that a lot of the work that I've been doing is in the context of municipalities. So what are some of the challenges for City of Toronto or York Region, whatever. But this is all applicable to private sector organizations too. Then I'll go through some of the existing frameworks in the space, and then the framework that we've developed that was launched just last year, and then some things related to skills, because I think that it's all nice to say like, let's do this, but these are tangible people with tangible jobs who work in engineering or planning who need the skills to be able to do this work. So that's what you're in for today. This is a little bit about us. So we're the Diversity Institute. Like I said, I'm Nancy. We exist within Toronto Metropolitan University, and we are a research institute. We do research on the experiences of different communities in the job market, in education, in entrepreneurship, innovation, all from the lens of inclusion. And then what we do is it's really applied research. I think research is great, but if it just exists on a shelf, it doesn't do too much good. So my team in particular tries to take that research and then make it applicable to different needs. So like I said, policing, municipal action, and in this case, climate change. So that's who we are. Okay, so I'll share a little bit about the disproportionate impacts of climate change on different communities to kind of situate us. And of course, I think many of us know that climate change is increasing in rate and intensity and severity across Canada. Things like flooding, rising temperatures, wildfires, we see all across Western Canada and into Ontario, and this is estimated to cost the government a significant amount of money. So it's really important, not only from like the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do, to consider how you embed equity into the retrofitting and the design of infrastructure. And before I go any further, what I will say, because I have some notes here, I will define infrastructure for you so we're on the same page, and I'll say that we're talking about this from the perspective of portfolio management and project design. So what I mean by that is, if you're a municipality, you'll often have different pieces of infrastructure in your portfolio that you're managing on a given time. So how are you deciding which piece of infrastructure to build or to retrofit based on what communities need? Then, once you've decided that you're going to go with that bridge or that wastewater management system, or you're going to build that cooling center, how do you make sure that it meets the needs of communities? So it's like the twofold process, because I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the portfolio management of it. So that, when I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about land infrastructure, so roads, highways, bridges, railways. I'm talking about buildings, straightforward, water and wastewater, groundwater, etc. So we're talking land, building, and I was going to say sea. I guess in some, not here, but maybe if you're on the coasts, sea. So questions on like what I'm talking about, portfolio management, design, how I'm defining infrastructure. You're with me? Yes.
Maybe really early on. You just
okay.
piqued my curiosity when and I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was almost like, is there a decision-making tree when you're assessing? I'm from a municipality.
Oh, which one?
City of Brampton.
Okay.
I work in sustainability.
Nice.
So the diversity, equity, inclusion side and the environmental side, I'm trying to bridge the connections.
Mm-hmm.
They mimic each other sometimes in kind of like the decision-making process. But you said something about assessing diversity and inclusion when you're trying to decide, you know, of what you're going to do with a particular neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything out there, like almost like I'm trying to develop a decision-making tree to
Totally.
incorporate the social and the environmental as we go through our planning processes and budgeting processes?
Yeah. I'll go through it. But I will say, so it involves, and I'll go into it, but like a risk assessment process. I should say, and I'll talk about this when I get to the slide, but when we made the framework, we worked with municipalities. So we sat with them to be like, what do you actually follow? And then how can I bake IDEA onto it? Rather than me like, you should do all these things.
Change your processes.
Exactly. No one's going to do that.
Work with what you got,
Right? Especially like if you're a tiny municipality, I'm not saying Brampton is, but if you are a small municipality and me coming in to say like, now forego everything you do, not gonna work. But what I'll also say is, if you're interested, get in touch with me, because we're doing some work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to build some tools to complement this framework, so that if you wanted to actually assess risk, you would plug all your variance into the tool we're making and it would spit out like, here's your risk type thing. So let's stay in touch. Okay, sweet. I hope you're in the right session on equity and nice. Okay, phew. Let's keep it going. Okay, so I will say, well, I've said this before, that different communities experience the impacts of climate change differently. This really relates to vulnerability, I'm sure most of you know this, but just in case. And vulnerability really relates to exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And I'll say, of course, like I'm not a climate expert, that's not my background, but what I've understood is that vulnerability is exposure plus sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. So what does that mean? Exposure is really being in a setting where you might be adversely impacted by climate change. So if you lived in BC where the wildfires were, if you lived on the coast and you were at tsunami risk, for example, you have heightened exposure. Sensitivity, the extent to which the infrastructure or the people will be affected by the climate change. So do you have strong and resilient infrastructure in place? So you're in BC and your home is not retrofitted properly. So heightened. Then your adaptive capacity, the ability to adjust to potential damages or respond to consequences. And in my notes, I have a number of things that shape that. So your age, if you're a child, I mean, what are you supposed to do? You rely on your family. If you're an older adult, what if you're someone living with a disability? What if you're someone with a lower socioeconomic status? So on and so forth. What if you're a rural, remote, indigenous population? So you're exposed to it, you don't have the proper infrastructure to meet the demands, and you're not able to respond. exposure, sensitivity, minus adaptive capacity, all relates to your vulnerability. And what we're seeing is diverse populations tend to have a more heightened vulnerability because of these different aspects. And what I have on this, in this little box, is like, all of this is impacted by your capital, your resources, colonialism, your decision-making power, which is particularly important for women, accessibility, physical and virtual accessibility, and so on. So a little bit of context framework, because I think so many times we're like, yeah, communities are disproportionately impacted, but we don't get into like the math of this plus this minus this equals your vulnerability. And if you're someone working in this space and you're trying to get buy-in from like maybe your leadership team or your colleagues, if you present a framework like this, I think it's more impactful. Okay, I'll go into this briefly. So when we're talking about women, I think the first thing to talk about is limited resource control. And that's from two perspectives. One is decision-making power. Oftentimes women are left out of the circles where major decisions about climate are being made. And this is adjacent, it's complementary, but I was doing some research years ago on conflict and war, and they were saying that women are often left out of the reparations and the solution making after war. And I know that's not what we're talking about, but a similar thing, that women are often left out of these positions. Also, when you look across Canada, women are often left out of leadership roles or roles that are high income earning, STEM, et cetera. And that means that perhaps they're less likely to bounce back or adapt after a major climate crisis because their socioeconomic capital is lower. Women are also often required to support the home in these kind of climate crises, support the children, for example. And when you're looking at some of the solutions like cooling and evacuation centers, are they considering gender-based violence and safety of women in them? So even sometimes the solution, I was reading some studies that showed that like women wouldn't go to these spaces because they weren't sure if they'd be safe in them and if their kids would be safe. So some of the general impacts on women that I think are quite tangible. Indigenous people, I mean, we can look at the legacy of colonialism and the fact that education was stolen from Indigenous people. Indigenous people were put in residential schools. They were relegated to spaces that are limited in terms of transportation. I was reading just before this study on Windsor and the fact that so many Indigenous and racialized people live in a particular area in Windsor that is next to the border, and they're exposed to the transport trucks every day. And you can imagine that that leads to chronic health issues as you have like air pollution. So here we have Indigenous peoples comprised of about 50% of the territories, which is warming at 4 times the global average. You can also think about Indigenous people in the north and the transportation to get up there. I was in Iqaluit, and the transportation systems are extremely different, as you can imagine. They rely on minimal seasonal transportation and also harsher climates up north as well, which means that if the infrastructure isn't retrofit to support, what are they relying on? And then a threat to traditional practices and livelihoods. And I think that oftentimes we talk about risk in the sense of like financial, but what does this mean for Indigenous communities who fish, who rely on the land for sustenance, who rely on it for their cultural practices? Like, I think that organizations and municipalities should be taking this into account when they're considering risk. People with disabilities, and hang on, I have some additional notes for you. So I think it's twofold. One, we see that when there's increased airborne pollution, the people who already have chronic conditions are then further exposed. Two, you have issues with accessibility in evacuation. If I'm living in an urban dense area in a condo and there is some kind of issue and I can't evacuate because I live in a wheelchair, like this is a very tangible example. Oftentimes evacuation efforts do not consider physical accessibility. And also virtual accessibility and any of the information that they share. Here's some information. In the 2021 BC heat dome, 91% of the people who died had at least one chronic disease. And then of course, when there are these climate emergencies, healthcare systems get disrupted. And what if you're someone that relied on regular appointments for your general needs? Some things to think about. Impacts on racialized people. So I had given the example of Windsor before. I think it's important to note experience of environmental racism and the fact that racialized people are often relegated to areas where this typically exist, so like the Windsor example, but also when you're thinking of the interlinkages between racialized people and newcomers who are more likely to live in urban areas that tend to be hotter with limited green space. What does that mean for like rising heat levels? I will also say, and right at the bottom, representation in the infrastructure sector. We have a lower, I say we because I am racialized, we have a lower representation in these decision-making roles similar to women. So who's actually shaping the decisions that are made is important to consider. And I think, yeah, this is my last slide on experiences. So impacts of immigrants, newcomers, and refugees. Something really key is information gaps. A lot of times newcomers, perhaps English is not their first language, and evacuation protocols are not in first languages that people understand. Also, like I said before, newcomers tend to live in urban areas that tend to be hotter, more densely populated. So what does that mean for their health? And then, of course, representation in the sector, engineering, planners, so who's actually shaping the decisions is important to consider. I've talked about a lot of things, but maybe there's a point that I haven't mentioned that you wanted to raise. Like, does anyone have anything they wanted to raise on some of the points, and maybe there's anything additional? Yeah, go ahead.
So, there been any research on like the intersections of those groups that you talked about, like racialized people with disabilities, or and so on?
Yeah, there has been some, and I don't want to misquote, but I was reading something months ago now about Indigenous women, and so their disruptions to their livelihood because they tend to take care of the home and engage in a lot of these traditional practices. But I would also imagine, like, we do research on the experiences of Black women. Black women are not typically in leadership roles, are typically in lower, what am I trying to say? Employment that has lower income, so the socioeconomic ability to bounce back. So I could just apply some of those learnings to intersectional thinking. Others, questions, thoughts, anything to add to the dialogue? Okay, if you have questions or you want to raise an additional point, feel free. I feel like lecturing. Okay, so what are some of the, sorry, you weren't, okay. What are some of the benefits of doing this work? And I think they're twofold. First, there are benefits for the organizations or the institutions, and then there are benefits for the individual people themselves. So things like achieving positive returns on investment, now that's more for general retrofitting with climate, but I will make the case that if you embed IDEA early on, you don't have to do it again later on. Building resilience and meeting community needs, driving innovative solutions, building trust with communities, and mitigating legal risks. These are all things that I think are benefits at the institution or municipal level. And then enhancing social justice and inclusion and reducing financial impacts on households, I think are more things at the individual level. And we'll go through each of these, and I have some notes. Amazing. So like I said before, I don't have a longitudinal study on if you embedded IDEA, you would recoup $1 trillion for the government. But there is research on the importance of embedding climate considerations and either designing or retrofitting with that in mind. So I'm happy to share some of the figures. Like I think it was like every $1 invested, you get $13 or $15 back, something like that. And I would make the case that if you do this early on, you won't have to do it again because, of course, climate is increasing in severity and impact, and it's only going to continue to impact communities. So if you consider early on, you won't have to retrofit later. I think a lot of municipalities are struggling with the fact that they have to retrofit so many of their buildings. Their building codes are not up to date, so they have to go through the archives. So achieving positive returns on investment, building resilience, reducing loss and damage, and meeting the needs of communities. There's a way to do this work while empowering communities themselves. I'll talk about some community benefits models, but if you do this, you again hopefully achieve positive returns on investment, but then you give projects back to communities so that they are able to sustain the projects themselves, and they bring money and funding back into their own communities, which helps with the long-term resilience. If everything relies on you as the overarching institution, you're not building that resilience among communities.
Sorry, Kim,
Yes.
before you move on,
Yeah.
Can you just state the dollar value again?
Yeah.
For $1, does you get 13 to 15?
It was like 13 to 15, but I also have climate change impacts is already costing individual households roughly $720 per year, and it's expected to rise to $2,000 by 2050. But all of this is in the, I can send you the report if you want. Other questions? Okay, speak. And I have this one, sorry, I have dual screen, but this was interesting. It's Alberta Powerline Project, and they coordinated with 7 Indigenous communities for a 40% equity stake. But what I really mean is that they gave the power back to Indigenous communities so that there was a building of resilience among Indigenous communities to lead their own projects, which I think is more sustainable in the long run as well. Driving innovative solutions, I think this is something I see across like all different sectors. It's when you have people who all have the same background, they're succumbing to groupthink. They find the same solution to the same problem over and over, and the cycle continues. If you include diverse perspectives in the decision-making process, there's more people who can say, wait, hey, hang on a second, that wouldn't be physically accessible, or wait, women wouldn't go to that, that cooling center because X, Y, Z. And thus, I think you save money in the long run because you don't put in solutions that then people don't actually use. So driving innovative solutions, no matter what sector, IDEA will help you regardless. And I've seen that in policing, in municipal, in health, so on and so forth. Building trust with communities. This one I think is a bit more tangible to conceptualize because it doesn't have, at least that I've seen, like a dollar value attributed to it. But when I work with municipalities, something I hear like time and time again is that they want to engage with communities, they want to support them, but they can't get in touch with communities because communities don't trust them. I don't know if this is something, you don't have to out-Brown it, but.
I'm only 2 years in, but
okay.
I can understand that.
Right, and I think, and I always advocate for like the communities need to be involved in the process and they need to be feeding back what their experiences are, but you can't get to them if they don't trust you. And so if you make a conscious effort, like if you're a municipality and you put it out there that this is what you're prioritizing and you do this over time, hopefully communities start to build trust with you and then you're better placed to continue to do this work and feed their perspectives back into it. And then mitigating legal risks and reputational risks. I have some regulatory requirements here, but things like the United Nations Rights on Indigenous People, the Accessible Act, Ontario Human Rights Code, Canada Human Rights Code, treaty requirements. I've seen I'm sure you've seen in the media, like times when a municipality has built on an Indigenous burial ground, or they have, they've gone over treaty rights. Things like this, which like have real legal and reputational consequences that you have to be mindful of. So I think doing this with that lens makes sure that your bases are covered just from that perspective. And then I have 2 when it comes to communities and individuals. I'll start with the reduced financial impact on households. So this goes back to what I had said previously. I'd given you that stat. Climate change is already costing households in Canada roughly $720 a year. It's expected to rise to $2,000 per 2050. You can think of homes that don't have insurance or coverage for things like disasters, flooding, what have you. If you're someone who already has a lower socioeconomic background, you can imagine how devastating that would be. Also, I was looking at some data from one of the big banks, but I cannot remember, but they were saying that wages stay repressed for quite a long time after a natural disaster. So all that to say is if you better support communities through a number of different interventions, just not just climate resilient infrastructure, but like adequate education, employment, good jobs, then hopefully there's a reduced financial impact on households. And then enhancing social inclusion and justice. And our work focused on a number of aspects of justice, so I'll go through them. Distributive justice, which focuses on the unequal impact of climate change on diverse communities. We talked about it. Procedural justice, making sure that equity-deserving communities are involved in the decision-making process throughout. Recognition justice of how climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. Talked about it. Relational justice builds fair and respectful relationships and dialogue for collaboration, going back to this building trust with communities. And transformational justice, which hopefully then has long-term positive impacts. So to say that I think, if I go back to this slide, there are positive outcomes for institutions and individuals when you consider IDEA in this work. Questions, comments? Anything to add? Okay, I'll keep going. What are the challenges? So like I said, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the challenges, and I think there's probably a lot, but these are the main ones that I have found. The first is this mentality of, I'll go through them at a high level and then I'll break them down on the slides. Oh, thanks.
Two for you.
Stop, thanks, that's nice. I'm sure there's more in the back if y'all want some. You don't have to just watch me and be like, thanks. Okay, so we'll go through some of them at a high level, but I imagine you've seen this at the municipal level. It requires a shift in our mindset from designing for the dominant or many versus what I'm calling designing for the few. Resources and capacity, this exists in any context. I think everyone here is tired, burnt out, everyone has a lot on their plate. Imagine that for a small municipality. Coordination, I see a lot of times, and this is in a municipal context, but like you have the parks people and they're doing their thing over here, and then you have the procurement people and they don't talk to the parks people, and then everyone is trying to do what the mayor wants and everyone's yeah, you're nodding. Good, so it resonates. Yeah. I mean, not good that it resonates, but you know. Yeah. So coordination. And then you can think of what happens if you procure some of these pieces out. So the municipality's like, you know what, we're not gonna do the engagement, or we're not gonna actually build the bridge. We're gonna hire Joe's engineering firm, and they give it all to Joe's engineering firm. How do they coordinate with Joe's engineering firm? And then identifying and using available data. I find that a lot of times people don't know where to find data on experiences, and they don't know how to use it. So those are some of the key issues that I'm finding. Okay, so we'll start with designing for equity-deserving groups. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, when you say data on experiences,
yes.
can you give an example of that?
Oh, sure. Okay, so in a couple of slides, I'll talk about the risk assessment framework, and I'm asking organizations to consider like who lives in their municipality or in their region, and then how they know what the vulnerabilities of these communities are. But that requires using like StatsCan data or other databases, and a lot of times people are like, okay, thanks, I don't, yeah, literally people are like, I didn't know you, right? And sometimes that exists in Toronto, but I don't know if it exists in another smaller municipality. So those kind of things. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, sweet. You stop me at any point. Okay, so I think this is really about a shift in mindset. The vibe is that, I think, you correct me, but the vibe is that we'll design for as many people as possible can use this bridge or this cooling center and it'll work. And I'm not saying that you need to totally shift that, like people should be able to use the cooling center, but I'm just saying that thinking about smaller representations of communities requires a shift, and I understand that it also relates to tangible dollars and capacity. A municipality is going to say, well, how many people are going to be able to use this bridge? Let's design for that. I think it goes back to understanding some of the key components of, let's say you're going to make a cooling center. It's not that you don't make the cooling center, but you understand that women might have a different relationship with it because they're worried about their safety. How can you ensure that the cooling center is mindful of those considerations for women? So it's not that you don't design the bridge for everyone, it's that you make sure that the walkway or the bridge is accessible for people with wheelchair users. You build the building, but you make sure that the evacuation protocols meet the needs of people with disabilities, or is multilingual so that someone who came from an African country where the language is Francophone predominantly can read the information. Something like that, right? So it requires a shift. I am hopeful. Okay, resources for inclusive climate resilient infrastructure. Hang on, yeah. I think a lot of times this is about personnel and funding, and if you're a smaller municipality, I get it, this can be tough. Sometimes it's like you have one person and this person is the parks person and the comms person and the rec person. So I understand. And sometimes it's that I've talked to municipalities who are like, thanks Nancy, I appreciate this. We get our budget from the mayor every year and that's what we work with. So I understand. I think that it requires a concerted effort from leadership in a municipal context to really reframe and understand the importance of this so that they put adequate budget towards it. And I think to reduce some of the capacity issues, rather than working in silos, you work complementary. But I will say that in a smaller municipality, I think that upskilling is important because I understand that sometimes there's only a few people doing a bunch of jobs. So upskilling so that people have this expertise, and then perhaps relying on community organizations, private sector organizations, so maybe partnerships that can be built, rather than that one person having to do all the jobs and now they add climate retrofitting to their portfolio. But sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but does that, anything you want to add from municipal context?
I don't know what to add. I come from the not-for-profit sector, environmental, but everything you're saying in relation to this, I'm like, yeah, because I'm experiencing it, the whole thing of the silos, short-sighted decisions instead of long-term strategic streamlined planning, like that's all resonating with me, and it's something that I'm trying to do from, like, in my opinion, we can drive, I'm gonna call this social, because
Sure.
it's sustainable procurement. So in my mind, we can drive social procurement and environmental procurement simultaneously, we just gotta take the time to do it properly.
Sure.
And go. And that's the key component I think that's missing in a lot of this.
Yeah, totally. And this is my hunch too, but I feel as though, and I'm not suggesting you change the whole political system, but just even because of election cycles, sometimes people are more short-sighted because I got, X amount of years to get some tangible results, and this, unfortunately, does require thinking 20 years into the future type of thing,
Yeah.
right?
I would argue that it's education of leadership, right? Like, to me, if I was a counselor and I understood this and I explained to my constituents that this is why it's taking so long, because
Sure.
we're trying, it goes back to the philosophy, if you're gonna do anything, it's worth doing right.
Sure.
And then you gotta kind of get those, it's mind shifts again, right? It's just trying to change behaviors that will change management aspect of it, so.
Totally.
We'll get there, I think.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a while.
Okay, I'm glad it's resonating though. Okay. Coordination across decision makers. So, like I said, I think so many operate in silos. If you're a municipality, the different divisions I find don't talk to one another. And even insofar as like, I'm asking you to engage with the community, the parks people, they have relationships with the Black community. They don't share that with the rec people. They don't share that with the procurement people. The procurement people, they have great relationships with the Indigenous community. Well, they don't share that back with the parks people. So there's all these silos happening. And then when you add on the procurement aspect and you kind of have a situation where, like I said, I've given it to Joe's engineering firm. Hopefully they do this EDIA thing properly, but I haven't put any protocols in place to make sure they're doing it or any KPIs. I'm just hoping that they're doing what I want them to do. So some coordination, and I'll share with you some ways I think we can mitigate that when I get to the framework. And then I don't have it on the slide, but you had asked earlier about data. I do have some data points. It's in the framework, so if you want the framework, I'll share it with you. My team did a good job at trying to find where disaggregated data exists. So where you can find, like if you were the city of Mississauga and you wanted to know who lived in your region, where you could find that, how you could disaggregate it, and some other frameworks or data you could use to figure out what their vulnerabilities are. And then even how you can read the data. I have a data guy, that's what he calls himself, and he wrote out instructions of like, here's how you would read it, and here's what you would look for, and here's what you would plug in. So if you want some information, let me know. But those are some general barriers that I think exist. Have I missed any that anyone knows of that you wanted to flag? Okay, sweet. Feel free to jump in. Okay, there's a number of existing resources. I won't go into all of them. If you're interested, I'll share them. Things like general tools, general research, but also standards. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about standards. The framework that I'm going to share in a little bit is called a publicly available specification. It's a step below a standard insofar as like if you don't follow it, you won't go to jail. But it's guidance. But there are a number of standards that exist. Canada has a standards body called the Standards Council of Canada, and then there's an international standards body where expert standard making people make international. It's very interesting. It doesn't sound like it, but I promise it is. And almost everything in your life is governed by some kind of standard. But what I think is key in this space is we can make standards on EDIA and climate-related infrastructure. It all needs to be made with end users in mind. A lot of times you have experts talking to themselves and being like, this is a great idea. And then the average person who works in a municipality takes it and is like, Okay, I can't do anything with this. So I'll share with you the quasi-standard that we made and how we made it, and some of the key components, taking into account end users, and hopefully it resonates with you. But if you wanted some resources on what to do in the space, they're on the slide. Something like ISO, this is International Standards Organization, they have a guide, or they have a standard on adaptation and climate change that you could use. Infrastructure's pathways and the PIVC engineering protocol. I'll focus on the PIVC one because I think it's interesting. Well, they're all interesting, but I think this one is especially. It helps evaluate risks and vulnerabilities of infrastructure projects on future weather conditions. So if you wanted to know whether your infrastructure was particularly vulnerable to a specific climate hazard, you could plug in your information into this and get some information. But what we're proposing is obviously layering on the IDEA aspect onto tools like this. So this is where the guide comes into play. But before I go, we've talked about the disproportionate impact, albeit at a high level, on different communities. We've talked about some of the benefits of doing this work, and we've talked about the challenges. Anything that anyone wants to share before I go into some frameworks? Yes?
Just a question, so this report is on your website?
Yeah, I can definitely share it with you. I should have made like a QR code or something. I'm not very, I'm always like, oh, I could have done this cool thing. Yeah, I'll share it with you.
We could get it, so.
Yeah.
You could get the slides though.
Sure, I'll send them with you. Yeah. And it's bilingual. And also keep in touch with me because like I said, we're making some tools to support the framework. So this is the framework. It was developed by us in conjunction with the Standards Council of Canada, like I mentioned, the standards folks, and then other experts and end users in the space. And what it's meant to do is it's meant to look at the two pieces I mentioned previously. So portfolio management and project design, and then what are some key steps that you could follow to embed IDEA in those processes. And it actually is like step by step. So like, have you thought of X, Y, Z? Okay, awesome. Have you thought of ABC? Okay, awesome. And then if you haven't, it kind of follows like a comply or explain model insofar as like, if you didn't follow ABC, why? Oh, because you didn't have the capacity or resources this time? Okay, what could you put in place so that you have the capacity and resources next time? I think it reads a bit like a checklist, and I will say up front that IDEA is not a checklist. It's like a way of doing things. But I do find that having questions that people can ask themselves as a point of self-reflection is helpful. So that's how it's organized. So these are the key components of it. It goes through all the stuff I talked about before, like disparities, benefits, challenges, but then it has the checklist, and maybe I'll show you after I go through the slides, like I'll just pull it up and show it to you. But it has questions that you should ask yourself. Then it has case studies, because in my experience, you need to see that someone else has done this work before you do it. And then other resources that you can leverage. How is it developed? I think this is key, because I feel like if I don't share with you how it's developed, then I don't follow my own practice of embedding IDEA into my work. So the way it was done was my team of like researchers, we developed preliminary research on it, and then we convened a steering group. The steering group was meant to be people from all different backgrounds across Canada. So you had Indigenous people and equity deserving groups, even groups like Accessible Standards Canada. Then you had planners and engineers from different municipalities, City of Fredericton, City of Ottawa, and then you had climate experts in the space to make sure that it had that climate lens infused into it, but that it also met the end user needs. Something that we really try to do is meet with municipalities, like I said, to understand the process that they follow. My understanding is they follow something called a value engineering process. Beats me. I was like, okay, I've got to learn this. But we tried to understand their processes so that we were layering IDEA onto them as opposed to suggesting an entirely new framework. So we convened this steering group. The steering group is responsible for always providing their guidance on the iterations of the draft. Then we did a public national engagement in English and French, where the document was posted live for a whole month and anyone could comment on it, or you could meet with me to share your perspectives. And then ultimately now the document is public in English and French. But that's a little bit about the process. Did you have any questions on the process? Okay. This is what the framework looks like, although after, I'm hoping I can just like pull it up and show you. But the way it works is that first, I shouldn't say it's like a 1, 2, 3. It's more like community engagement is central to every activity, and community engagement is important for portfolio management and project prioritization, and it's important for project design. So I'll go through what community engagement looks like, but what our team found is that you can't just engage communities one time. You need to be engaging, you need to be engaging them on an ongoing basis. First, to understand if they actually like the infrastructure that already exists, and what piece of infrastructure they feel needs to be retrofitted first. And I'm not saying, I understand there's constraints, like you can't just go off of what a couple people want and then make a whole thing, but their perspectives need to be included throughout. So their perspectives need to be involved in the management process, and then once you've decided, okay, we're going to make a cooling station, or we're going to retrofit this bridge, then you re-engage them to understand how their perspectives can shape the design of that new piece of infrastructure or the retrofit. So it's less like 1, 2, 3, and more like engagement overarching, then portfolio management, project prioritization, then we've decided on the piece of infrastructure, now we're designing it. This is the framework for ongoing community engagement. I think everything stems from relationship building. So you need to be, if you were in a municipality, for example, you would break down some of the silos and understand what engagement has already been done, who has connections with what community, and you would put all of that, like you would collate it together to understand what relationships you have and where some of the gaps exist so that you can foster the relationships that then feed into later like tangible engagement. You would need to be making some real clear engagement strategies, so why you want to engage the public, where their perspectives are going to go, how it's going to be used, and what your communication strategy is for afterwards. So like, we came to you, we asked you about the prioritization of all these different pieces of infrastructure. You can't just now like not talk to them again for 10 years. You have to then say, okay, here's where your information went. I already talked about this a little bit, but internal coordination and collaborating across different departments to make this happen. Again, some people have relationships with different communities that others don't. Allocating a sufficient budget and resources for engagement. I find that a lot of times engagement is like one webinar that exists that you do, whatever. But a lot of times people want to engage in person, or they want to do webinars, or they want to do both. And have you considered, like, if you're meeting people in person, is it close to transportation routes? Are you able to provide things like bus tokens? We've done some engagement where we provided bus tokens or where we provided recreation passes, that kind of thing. But ultimately, you need to have enough budget and resources to be able to do like a proper engagement. You need to be seeking informed consent throughout. And you need to be engaging people on an ongoing basis and then evaluating whether your engagement worked. So maybe you only had that one webinar and maybe it worked and you got a lot of people come out. Maybe you had that one webinar and you were like, would have been better if we met people in person. Next time we'll come to the community center where they are. We do a lot of community engagement. I find that if you make relationships with local leaders, or you make relationships with like the local community center, and you say like, what programming do you have on a Tuesday night? And they're like, oh, we have this programming for newcomers. Great, I will be there and I will share about my project. I was about to be like easy, but I think those are better ways than saying like, we're gonna have a webinar as the City of Toronto, please come, and hoping that people come. Being a little bit creative. And I will say, like I said, this engagement is required in the portfolio management process and the project design process. Questions? Okay. I have some case studies, but in the interest of time, I'll just let you see the slides. But these are some examples. Like I said, I think people need to see that the work has been done. These are examples of other municipalities that got really creative with their engagement process. I'll let you take a photo and then I'll move on. Okay. Portfolio management. So here, I think it's really about leveraging data. If you need the data, I'm happy to find some for you or share where it exists. But ultimately, the first step is understanding the condition of the infrastructure in your portfolio. So what is out of date in terms of building codes? Which pieces of infrastructure are on the brink of falling apart? Which ones were recently made? So first, you understand the condition of your infrastructure. Then you try to understand the people that live in your region. Are you a region that has a very large Indigenous population? Do you have a lot of newcomers coming to your city, for example? So you know the infrastructure condition, you know the people. Then you try to understand the vulnerabilities of the community. So do you have a large portion of people living with disabilities, for example? What are people's adaptive capacity? Like, do you have a lot of people that rely on your public transportation to get from point A to point B? Or do most people have cars? Do you have a lot of people that live in the urban center versus the rural area? Like, you try to go back to that the mathematical equation I provided previously, which was exposure sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. And there are some frameworks that exist that you can plug in to try to understand this. Then, based on all of those pieces of information, you evaluate the risk. So if I don't retrofit this piece of infrastructure, what will that mean? That piece of infrastructure hasn't been retrofitted in 25 years, so that's a risk. That goes back to the collecting maintenance information at the beginning. That piece of infrastructure is also something that a lot of communities, particularly newcomer communities, rely on to get from point A to point B. So another risk. And I have a number of risks on the slide because I find that often municipalities, but private sector organizations, tend to conceptualize risk just in terms of financial risk, but there's a whole host of other risks. Things like legal risks, reputational risks, relationship and activity risks. If you decided to retrofit a bridge where the community only relies on that bridge to get from point A to point B, like, what does that mean for the people who have jobs in point B and they live in point A? Health and livelihood risks. If you decide not to do something about a climate change issue, or you decide to retrofit a piece of infrastructure where Indigenous people rely on the fishing abilities of like that waterway system, or they rely on like living off the land and the sustenance, like what does that look like? And then accessibility risks. What about people who physically cannot evacuate a building? So I think embedding EDIA into a municipal process requires reconceptualizing what we consider as a risk, and it's not just the financial risk, it's all of these different risks. So I'm not asking the municipality to totally change their evaluation process. You go through, what I understand, I could be wrong, but after consultation with municipalities, I understand that they typically do this process in their portfolio management. I'm not asking you to change it. I'm just saying, have you thought about this risk? Have you thought about that risk? And can that better inform the decision making? And then when it does, you're applying EDIA as opposed to just saying like, well, this is costly, this is not costly. Questions? Comments before I continue? And I realize I will just back up and say, like, I understand that this is a very like, just do this, right? Like, I'm not trying to be flippant about it at all. I understand that this framework requires trial and error, like trying it out and seeing if it works. But when I talk to municipalities, like, this is what they felt like would be helpful to them.
So those risks would be identified potentially in some of them at least, as part of the engagement process. Like, if you were to do this, what would this mean for you?
Totally, yeah. It could be identified in the engagement, or perhaps just through like some deductive, like using the data and being like, okay, well, we're about to retrofit something that's on Indigenous land, or that we know that they fish in this area, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Help you think through things that you haven't thought about, right? Like,
that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Is like, I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't know if a lot of people are actually conceptualizing these kinds of risks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I have some examples, although I feel like I went through them. But even like, does the action you're about to take disrupt traditional food sources? Is it going to cause job loss? So again, I mentioned the point A to point B. Mitigating accessibility and mobility issues, things like this, because all of this goes back to the barriers that I had mentioned in the very beginning of like socioeconomic capacity and ability. If what you're about to do is going to take jobs away from communities, or it's going to disrupt transportation, that makes people even all that more vulnerable. I have some examples of cities and organizations that are trying to embed this in their risk assessment, PEI, for example. And then the Federation of Canadian Municipalities does have a framework that you can use as well. But I'll show the slides. Okay, so project design and value engineering. So here we're talking about the actual step, and I have some, actually, one second. Okay, I have some on my other screen, but the actual steps to designing the piece of infrastructure. So you've decided, you've looked at like the building codes, the community needs, the vulnerability, and you've decided that now you're going to put in a cooling center or you're going to retrofit a piece of infrastructure. How are you going to design it in a way that meets community needs? Well, first it goes back to the ongoing community engagement. You need to re-engage people on their needs. But then you need to make sure that you're following a couple of key steps, and it's in the framework, but things like the physical accessibility of the actual piece of infrastructure, the location of the infrastructure. Are you putting a cooling center in a spot where it's not near like any actual transportation, where people would need their car to get to it? That won't work for people. We had an Indigenous expert on our steering committee, and she had raised the Highway 16, which I guess is more commonly known as the Highway of Tears out west. And it's this long piece of highway where a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous women, like where missing and murdered Indigenous women go missing and get murdered, because it's such a long stretch of highway where there's hitchhiking, there's limited visibility, limited lighting. And she was like, if you're gonna make infrastructure, you can't replicate those kind of issues in it. And I was like, wow, what a tangible example of like something that is existing right now that doesn't work for people. So thinking of that, I mentioned land use. So even questions like for water and wastewater systems, will it disrupt, like I said, the fishing rights? What about evacuation processes in your infrastructure? Do these consider multilingual? Oh, sorry. Will these be multilingual? Will they be available in Braille? Will they be available in multiple formats? So the guide has a number of questions that you should be asking yourself, like, will it be accessible with transportation? What is the evacuation protocol? What is the lighting of the piece of infrastructure? And that seems very like, well, yeah, we would have thought of that, but tangible examples like the Highway of Tears where people didn't think about it. So questions in the design. Then there's two other pieces that go into the project design process. It's the team who's making the decisions. And oftentimes I find that the decisions are not being informed, like I said, by end users. So who do you have around the decision-making table? And then the procurement process. And I find this very interesting because I learned that a lot of municipalities are giving this process over to another organization, whether it's the actual engagement process or whether it's the design. And if you don't have these expectations baked into the procurement process, like the bid, if you're not asking, well, what is going to be your approach for the community engagement? Are you going to be adopting a community benefits model where you're giving jobs back to the communities, or you're giving a piece of ownership to Indigenous peoples in the design? If you're not asking that from the outset and asking your the bidder to tangibly demonstrate this and then developing frameworks so that they do that actually, then you're exonerating yourself of all responsibilities and you have no way of making sure that this is actually getting done. So I think the procurement piece is a big one. And then, of course, there's some examples. So community benefits agreements where, of course, you'd be doing this work, but a piece of the work would be given to Indigenous communities for their own decision making. It would bring jobs back into their community. Even the city of Surrey targeting 20 to 30% of employment hours carried by equity deserving groups. The city also committed 50% of purchasing from small and medium-sized enterprises locally. So I think, again, procurement, a big piece because so much of the work gets procured out. But do you have comments or questions on the project design process?
Just knowing this,
Yeah.
if you were going to respond to a bid, whether or not, like,
Sure.
there's an actual, they've stipulated within the RFP that these are the things we want, this gives you the competitive advantage if you already put it in there, because you take
Totally.
the layer out for who you're actually trying to get the work done. I love it.
Yeah, and I will say, like, because we're a self-funded team, so I bid on things all the time. Increasingly, the end user wants you to demonstrate that. So I'm constantly writing things in of like, what are my social procurement values? What approach do I take to climate change, like green skills, climate adaptation? Who do I have on my team? What is my approach to community engagement? So best to think about it now if you were interested in any of these projects, because people are asking about it. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
So procurement is really important. The problem is procurement is not sexy.
I know.
Just to get people engaged, that community members engaged and saying, hey, let's talk about procurement. they look at how bureaucratic the process is, and then after it's over, and they say, all right. How do we make procurement more interesting to ordinary community members, and how do we make work with community members more interesting to procurement people?
Okay. I think you're right that it feels not very sexy. Okay, how can I, because I have lots of thoughts. I think that I'm going to go with the municipality. I think that the municipality needs to look at their procurement systems and break down barriers that would limit small local organizations from bidding. There's a number of ways they can do that. And I know that oftentimes procurement teams are like, there's bylaws and we can't do this. But of course, there are ways that it can be done. There's even things like we're going to dedicate X% to local businesses, or we're going to ask you in your bid to demonstrate ABC. So there's ways they can break it down. And then I even think, maybe this is naive, but I think that we're so technical. If you approach community not with like, I have a procurement opportunity, if you broke it down with very basic language of like, we're gonna do this project, we'd like it to create jobs in your community, this is what it would look like, I think it would make it, I was gonna say sexier, but like I think it would break down some of the, even when I learned about procurement, I was like, I don't get what this is, until someone explained it tangibly. So all that to say is the municipality breaks down the procurement barriers on their end, and I have some examples if you need, and then they communicate it in tangible ways with the community so the community isn't lost with big language. Questions, thoughts, comments?
I would say there's a shift in procurement though. So I was advocating to municipalities and teaching them how to use the procurement more wisely to drive environmental outcomes. Now I'm in the position of working within the municipality to use that process to change the way the city of Brampton procures so that we create more social and environmental outcomes. So I think there is a shift happening. It's slow, and I think you have to start small in order to get that buy-in from the community as well as from leadership to show the value of going and changing our processes. So it's starting. It's a slow boat. But it's growing. There's lots of municipalities now that are engaging in supplier diversity. There's a lot of municipalities. We have a community benefits policy now.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's good.
Yeah, so it's starting, like sustainability, social, environmental, but yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah. You were going to say?
Might there be legal challenges to having a policy of, procure locally, buy locally? If a company, like a bigger, maybe a national company, feels like they lost a bid because of preferential treatment for a local group over their lower price, is there a challenge there?
I think so, and you probably can speak to it. Yeah, I think so, but I will say, and I won't share the details because client, but we've done work with different clients on navigating the legal aspects in the bylaw, and I think there are ways of putting this in place where you don't, like there isn't a, you can put, right?
I think that it's all in the way that you specify it.
Yeah.
So there's like, Europe does this a lot. Instead of specifying, you create an outcome. So you can reword it and be clever in the words. But then, I mean, our provincial government now has buy local policy
Thank you so much.
the buy Canadian now legislation. So that's kind of what they're because of the tariff situation.
Yeah, but I think also like even if you don't have something like we're giving 50% X to small businesses, you can still ask people to demonstrate like who their team is and what their approach is going to be, and then you can hold them to that when the project is going on. So you can say like in your bid you demonstrated ABC. We have tons of contracts where if I don't follow through with what I said I was going to do, like they terminate the contract. Yeah. Okay. 7 minutes. We're gonna do it. Okay, what I will say is this is kind of still under development, but I didn't want to leave you with just like you should do all this work without skills. And my colleague Bryant, I wish he was here, but he's not, but he does a lot of our skills related work, and some of the findings he has found is that a lot of times this work focuses on the issue identification and not what people can do about it. So that's why we put the guide in place. A lot of times people don't actually know what IDEA is. They know about it tangibly. So they're like, yeah, I get what inclusion is, but they don't know what that would look like in a project. A lot of times people are generalists. Well, I should say you have some people who are like, I am an engineer and I know this, but then a lot of people in municipalities tend to be generalists, and how do you make sure that they have the skills they need? And then I also think wraparound supports for diverse users and also people working in the space. So if you were gonna make a piece of infrastructure, you need to make sure that there was the adequate transportation to get there. And then on the flip side, if you want someone to be able to do this work, can you provide work integrated learning for them? Can you provide maybe like on the job, like internship-y kind of ways that people can upskill? Because I think there needs to be some framework of how you integrate the skills that are needed to do this job into people's jobs. And it's something that we're still thinking through, but again, you need to be providing people with like tangible interventions, not just like pie in the sky, nice things to do. You need to be really educating people on what IDEA is. And if you look in our guide, we broke down like, here is what equity would mean in this context, as opposed to just like general stuff. You need to recognize that people are typically generalists. And so how can you make sure that they have all the different facets of knowledge? And you need to be providing work integrated learning opportunities for them. And I'm gonna go through this. So Brian and I have been working on this framework, investing in soft technical and analytic skills for training, complementing accessibility with equity. A lot of times accessibility in the IDEA framework is the more tangible thing. Like it's very tangible to me to understand that someone with a wheelchair wouldn't be able to go down the stairs in that way. But people don't know what equity and inclusion and diversity means. So trying to get people to integrate those concepts, even just like who's around your decision-making table, is key. Trying to understand the fact that people operate multiple different roles in a city, for example, and upskilling them. So here we have a framework of like, you would try to get people to understand, you would try to have people have foundational environmental skills. Like you need people to generally understand that framework I shared earlier of vulnerability is exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Like people need to have some general sense of that. They need to have some general sense of what IDEA is, not just the accessibility piece. Then they need to have the applied skills, so how they actually take all that knowledge and then do something with it, which is the framework that we have provided. And then you can get further up into some of these deep skills, like you'd have your PhD people who know a lot about waterway systems. But I would say that most people are in the foundational and applied skills. So some kind of integrated learning to help them understand is key. 256. Conclusion. Okay, so tackling climate change really requires embedding IDEA within it. I think that we can't be, and you see this around the world, but you can't be doing this kind of work and leaving out Indigenous people, women, racialized people, people with disabilities, the 2S LGBTQ+ community, newcomers and immigrants. We've made a framework to try to help with that, and the appendix has some resources that you can leverage for data, tangible examples, case studies. There's lots of frameworks that exist in the ecosystem that we built on, like the PIVC one or ISO. And then ultimately, we need to be upskilling people, not just expecting them to take this framework and then run with it. Some kind of work integrated learning is needed to support them. So lots of work to do. That's my presentation, and I think we're just about on time. Did anyone have any questions or comments? Yes?
Could you leave your email back on the screen?
Was my email on the screen?
I think it was at the very beginning.
Yes, for sure. And if it wasn't, I will give it to you. I don't think it was, but it's n, like Nancy, .mitchell, M-I-T-C-H-E-L-L, at torontomu.ca, and I can also just give it to you. And I wonder if like there's a way, where there's a will, there's a way, I feel. But, okay. Oh, I'll just show it to you quickly because we have a few minutes. So this is the guide. I'll skip through all of the like background pieces. But then here we have a framework, so really understanding ongoing community engagement is critical. Then you have your portfolio management and your project design. You have the components I went through, so understanding the climate, the infrastructure, and the communities, and doing a risk assessment, and then some of the key things that exist within these buckets. You have then your project design and your design elements, and then your team composition. And then if you go through the guide, we actually give you like, have you done this? Are relationships in place? Have you leveraged previous engagements? Are outcomes of those previous engagements reviewed to understand gaps in outcomes? If I scroll further down to portfolio management, do you have updated information on the state of your infrastructure? Have infrastructure maintenance data tools been used to, like some key questions you can ask yourself, and then embedded, oh, you didn't know where to find that? Here, 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 type of thing. And it continues as you go further down. Here we're in the risk section, so like if I wanted to know questions about health and livelihood risks, I have a list. And then you keep going to, I think I'm now probably in the project design, so design elements. Do you engage with the community? Does it align with these different frameworks? Is it located near where communities access transportation? Is it going to be on culturally significant sites that would impact Indigenous treaty rights? What about your procurement? That kind of thing. So it's just some general questions you can ask yourself. And then, of course, a checklist, and then all the different data tools and case studies that you can leverage. So that's what it looks like. Questions, comments, thoughts? You're going to use it immediately. Okay, well, that's my time. It's 3 o'clock, so I think you probably have other things in the program. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Hello. Hi, Nancy.
Juliet.
Juliet.